So we're in Daniel chapter 5, and just to kind of catch up to speed, King Nebuchadnezzar is gone. King Nebuchadnezzar is dead. King Nebuchadnezzar has kicked the bucket. How many different ways can I say it? He's out of here. But this is the amazing thing, especially if you've been in here for a while, you know the pattern is that kings in the Old Testament typically begin well and end poorly. And yet Nebuchadnezzar kind of reverses that because he ends very, very poorly, he begins very, very poorly and he ends well because he's learned his lesson, and it took him a long time and he had to hit rock bottom, but by the time the last thing we find out about him, he's writing a letter and sending it out to the four corners of the world, telling everybody about this great God who is able to humble people who walk in pride, but he does it for our benefit. So he's passed away and there's a new king, and it's got to be a little bit disconcerting for the people of God now because Nebuchadnezzar had kind of waffled back and forth across that line, and he'd kind of flirted with it for a long time, and finally he does come across the line, and now he's gone. And so any hope of reform would have passed on with him. And so now there's this new king, and it's his son, and here's how we're introduced to him. Daniel chapter 5, starting verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So that's how we're introduced to the new king. Oh, we made so much progress with the old king, and now it feels like we're having to start back over at square one again. Now, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but I'm going to read this again, and I want you to see if you can figure out there's one verb that's used several times in these four verses. Let's see if you can figure it out. You ready? King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. You're catching on. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay. One word used 5 times in 4 sentences. That's standing out to me a little bit because we've talked about this before, that in Hebrew, they couldn't change the font, they couldn't highlight it, they couldn't underline it or put it in bold or italics or something like that. If they wanted to draw your attention to it, the way they would do it is by repeating a word several times. So the fact that this is repeated 5 times in 4 sentences means something significant. I would say there's a lot of drinking going on. That's just sort of that, And so a couple of different things about this party. First of all, how many people are at the party? 1,000 of his nobles. So this is a big, big party. This isn't like a house party or a block party or something like that. This is like, it's 1,000 people. So it's a very expensive kind of party. And it takes a lot of wine to have 1,000 people drinking that much. So it's a very, very expensive kind of party. And third, that's kind of unusual, is there are actually women at this party, which was very unusual for the time. Women were generally not allowed in the party. But notice it's a particular category of women who are at the party. Who are they? Wives and concubines. So basically, what the king has done is he's populated the party with his harem. And these women are drinking as well. Drinking women in public in this period in time meant pretty much one thing, that they would be there. So the writer is trying to be a little bit delicate about what's going on here, but we can all kind of fill in the blanks on what's really happening here. It's a particular kind of party. Okay, and generally speaking, sin of this kind follows a pattern known as the law of diminishing returns. In other words, what gave you a real big buzz last week may not give you the same level of buzz this week, and so you have to kind of up the ante a little bit, and so you're always looking for one more boundary to cross and one more. Last time we had 15 drinks, and this time we have to have 20 drinks. Did anybody see 2020 last weekend? 2020 did that special about binge drinking on college campuses, especially among young women. And that was one of the things they were talking about, was it starts out, a real kind of a moderate level of alcohol consumption, but then the next weekend you feel like you have to go one more than you did last time, and it eventually just escalates to the point of no return. And so that's kind of what's going on here. The king has this little law of diminishing returns, and he's not quite getting the same kind of buzz and excitement that he would have before, and so he decides to up the ante. And how does he choose to do it? He says, go get those goblets. Oh yeah, this will be great. This will be fun. Go get those goblets that my dad stole from Jerusalem. Those Israelites, they're always worshiping their God. So we'll get their holy sacred objects and we'll use them in our drunken orgy party. And that'll give us a little bit extra excitement. Now look at verse 2. You see where it says, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine? That could also be translated, while he was under the influence of wine. So the implication here is that he probably wouldn't have done that if he'd been sober. But sometimes when you get intoxicated, from what I've read, you might do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. I went to college, you went to college, right? So, sometimes you do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. That's one of the dangers of alcohol consumption, is it lowers your inhibitions, and it may prompt you to do something that if you were sober and in your right mind, you would think, oh, there's no way I would do that. But now all of a sudden it makes sense because you're not thinking clearly. And let me just stop and say this. I don't know what your church background was. One of the great things about this class is we got people from so many diverse backgrounds. People who were raised in Methodist and Presbyterian and Catholic, and some weren't raised going to church at all, and some were raised going to, we've got a lot of diverse backgrounds in here. I'll just tell you, the church I was raised in did not encourage the drinking of alcohol. In fact, it was kind of a litmus test for how you could tell who was really spiritually mature and who wasn't spiritually mature. I remember my sister and I were talking about this. The scandal that hit our church when one of the girls in our youth group let it slip that her parents drink wine with dinner. We were just we were speechless, all of a sudden, and we're thinking, well, he's not going to be a deacon for very long now, because that was one of the things. You couldn't do that and be a deacon, and that was just one of the ways we separated who was spiritual from who wasn't, was whether or not you would drink. Now, so that one of the problems that creates is there are certain verses and parts of the Bible that we just like to pretend weren't in there, like in Psalm 104, where it actually says that God makes wine which gladdens the hearts of men. We didn't read that one very much in our Sunday morning assemblies. Or in Deuteronomy 14, in Deuteronomy 14, it actually says, if you live so far away from the place where the sacrifices are being made that you can't get your tithe and get your family and get everyone and come, here's what you're supposed to do. Take your tithe and go and buy whatever you want with it. Go buy beef and lamb and strong drink. It actually says go buy strong drink with it if you can't make it into the temple, and you throw a big block party for everybody and you eat and drink until it's gone. I never heard that verse talked about when I was a kid. That was never the text for the sermon. Or Isaiah 55, all who are thirsty and have no money, come and buy wine. That was, again, never, and even like in the New Testament where Jesus makes wine, I have books in my library that will explain to you, go through ridiculous lengths to explain to you that wine doesn't really mean wine. Did anybody else hear that when you were a kid, that wine didn't actually have alcohol, and yet people somehow or other were able to get drunk on it? It was something like a sugar buzz or something, instead of actually being drunk on it. And yet, Jesus had a reputation. The Pharisees looked at Jesus and they used two words to describe him quite often. You might remember what those two words were? One was a glutton and the other was a a wine bibber, which that's the King James version of it. And I never, wine bibber. My sister and I always joke, you're a wine bibber. You're a wine bibber. A drunkard and a glutton. That's what they called Jesus. And one of the reasons they called him that, I mean, you don't call a teetotaler that. And Jesus had parties, and he would go to parties, and you got to think that there was some drinking going on. He's partying with pagan people. And yet we were told, you can't even go to a place that serves alcohol. And unfortunately, I just have a little bit of a problem, and I know this is making some of you really uncomfortable, but I'm just going to go ahead and say this. When we try to be more spiritual than Jesus, I think, there's a disconnect there. So let me just say this. The Bible does not say anywhere that people who abstain from alcohol are more spiritual than other people. The Bible never says that people who abstain from alcohol sin less than people, or a less sinful race of people, okay? The Bible doesn't say that. However, the Bible does warn us very strongly about the abuse and overconsumption of alcohol. And there are people in this room who can attest to the fact that very few things in life are as damaging as alcohol abuse and alcohol misuse. So we have to be honest and say, what the Bible doesn't say, but also be honest and say the Bible cautions us very, very strongly about how we engage in our world, okay? Now, the king's problems here didn't come as a result of his drinking. I think there's more going on here that we'll unpack in a little bit, but I will say this. Drinking probably didn't help him very much. If you're really trying to live a lifestyle that honors God and builds community with other people, I'm going to tell you, introducing mass quantities of alcohol into that equation are not going to help you live a more God-honoring lifestyle. Okay, I'll just say it that way, okay? And one of the reasons why I've spent the last several minutes talking about this is because I'm afraid that we've so stigmatized it in so many churches that nobody's willing to talk about it openly. And again, because we have such a diverse group here, I just know, again, I'm not spying on anybody, but I know statistically speaking, there's probably somebody in this room who may be struggling with this issue. And I want you to know, if that's you, there's healing and there's help and there's grace for that. And you should not allow your fear of what others might think of you to keep you from getting the help you need to get. We have a counseling center here, and there are recovery groups that meet here on a consistent basis. There are people who would be very, very happy to get you in touch with the help that you need if you're struggling with this problem. And there may be people here who you're thinking, well, this isn't really a problem that I struggle with, but boy, I know somebody, and I usually discourage you from thinking about other people and how this might impact them, but this is a situation where that's okay. If there's somebody that you know who you think might have a problem, muster up the courage to have that conversation. Because there's too much at stake and too many lives get damaged too deeply for us to allow our fear to keep us from doing what we need to do. Sometimes it requires an intervention. And David Blackwell, who sometimes teaches in here, that's one of the things that David does for a living. David helps families organize interventions. And if that's something you feel like you need to do, maybe David would be a good person, a good resource person for you to contact. We're about to see the mother of all interventions. Okay, I'll just tell you that. Look at verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale. He was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. And he probably thought, maybe I've had a little too much. Maybe I need to switch from Cabernet to coffee, So the king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. And this man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he'll tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now, I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Now, let's stop there for just a minute, because the king sees this writing and it freaks him out. And, especially when he realizes that's real. That's not a hallucination. There are actually words up there, and he can't tell what it means, and that just terrifies him even further. And nobody can help him until the queen hears all the commotion. And this is probably his mother, the queen. And she remembers an advisor that used to work for his father named Daniel. Now, a lot of times, you ever know somebody who's kind of frozen in time at a certain age in your mind? We were talking about this at our small group the other night, and Pam Blackwell said, Dick Clark. Like, Dick Clark is always the same age. But it's not just Dick Clark. Sometimes you ever watch, like, on PBS, and they have those, 50s doo-wop reunited groups, and you look at them and you're like, man, what happened to them? Because in your mind, they still look like they did in 1955, and you see them and you're like, wow, that doesn't look at all. And Daniel is one of those characters. He's kind of frozen in most people's minds at a certain age, like a youngish man, maybe 20-something. In most people, when you mention Daniel, everybody tends to think of Daniel as a 20-something young man. But by now, Daniel is older than that. In fact, anybody remember when Daniel came to the kingdom? When he was transported from Jerusalem to Babylon? A whole group of people were. He was probably a teenager. But how long had Nebuchadnezzar been in office? It was the second year of his reign. That's the very first of Daniel says in the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So and Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 40 years. So it's been 40 years since Daniel was that young man. Daniel is probably late 50s, early 60s, which for that time was a much older man. And Daniel gets called in to see the new king. Daniel's not there. Daniel is probably in bed because he went to bed at like 4 o'clock, because he's... And right after he had dinner. Daniel's probably not moving as fast as he once did. There was a time when he could march all the way from Jerusalem to Babylon, 700 miles, and now he's probably moving a little bit slower than he used to. Daniel had to go get woken up in the middle of the night and had to dress himself and had to be brought. And so the party just pretty much stops, if you can imagine that. 1,000 drunk people stopped the party, go send for this guy. Finally, he comes shuffling in. As he walks in, he looks out at the room, and it doesn't take much to see what's been going on here. But what catches his eye, do you suppose? as he's looking, there's the writing on the wall, but what do you suppose he's going to notice? Those goblets. Remember those goblets? Those goblets of gold and silver that got taken from the temple in Jerusalem. How long has it been since Daniel's seen those things? It's been 45 years probably since Daniel had even laid eyes on them. And what do you think went through Daniel's mind and his heart when he sees these things? He probably remembers, wow, you remember what worship was like in the temple. You remember what it was like to feel the presence of the Lord, to know you were in the place that God had set His name, to see those objects which were only used in worship. And now he realizes they've been used here for illicit purposes. And so he's got this kind of mix of nostalgia and outrage all at the same time. And think about this too. Last time we saw Daniel, where was he in terms of status? Personal advisor to the king. He'd been set over an entire province of Babylon. Where is he now? The king doesn't even know who he is. He's been discarded. He's been put out to pasture. And it's obviously not because he's lost his gifts. It's obviously not because he's lost his wits. What do you suppose would have caused this king to discard Daniel? Daniel had a particular habit that I'm not sure this king was receptive towards. Daniel had a habit of just telling the truth. Remember, he even one time, he kind of hesitates, and Nebuchadnezzar, for all the bad stuff Nebuchadnezzar was when he was bad, he was at least open to hearing the truth. And this king doesn't seem to be that open to it. And so he's deposed Daniel. Daniel is an old man whose career has been wrecked, who's been put out to pasture. He walks in and he sees that not only has the king insulted him, but now the king has insulted his God. And this king turns to Daniel and says, hey, would you do me a favor? Would you tell me what that stuff means up there? Now, I got to tell you, if I'm Daniel, I'll say, figure it out for yourself. You know? But Daniel is such great character. And he even tells him, hey, listen, if you tell me what it says, I'll give you lots of stuff. And the implication is probably make sure you guard very carefully what it is you tell me that it means, because the better news it is, the more stuff you might get. You know, that's the way it is with people in power. And the Babylonian kings knew what to do with power. You know, they knew how to wield their power. And when you're in that kind of a powerful position, you don't always get the truth, but you do usually get what you want to hear. And so Daniel's temptation is probably at this point in time to shrink back from telling the king the truth. And that's a lot of times when you're talking to somebody, a superior or someone you respect a lot, or someone who has things that you want access to, the temptation a lot of times is to pull back from telling them the full truth because you want to get what they have. And you think that by softening it maybe. But Daniel makes it really clear. I'm not going to play that way at all. Look at verse 17. Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. It's so bold to say that. You can keep your stuff. Listen, I'm not doing what I'm doing to get the stuff that's in your hand, okay? If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, and you don't have to bribe me in order to get me to do it, okay? Verse 18. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. And those he wanted to spare, he spared. And those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver, of gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. The most damaging phrase in this whole sort of proclamation that Daniel makes, the one that just stops you dead in your tracks. You knew. I mean, it's bad enough that you did all this foolish stuff, but you knew. You were there when your father lost his throne and his sanity. You were there. You had a front row seat for all of this. You knew better, and you did it anyway. It's amazing to me. There's this this bizarre thing about people that we tend to prefer ignorance to responsibility. We would rather be ignorant than be held responsible for things. For example, have you ever heard somebody use a phrase like this? It is easier to ask forgiveness than permission. You ever heard somebody say that? You know what kills? I hear people in churches say that. I hear like pastors and preachers and deacons and ministry leaders say stuff like that. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. You know what they're saying is, I don't want to know what the policy is. I don't want to know what their opinion is. I don't want to know that stuff because, why? I want to do what I want to do. I'm going to do this, and I'm afraid if I go to someone I'm supposed to be in submission to, they're going to tell me no, and rather than do that and do the honorable thing, I would rather do the dishonorable thing and close my eyes and say, well, I didn't know. It does. You ever get stopped by a police officer? This is a great example of this. You ever get stopped by a police officer, and the police officer asks you, like, the dumbest question ever, do you know how fast you were going? Right? And the typical response is, no, I have no idea. Now, have you ever heard of a police officer who said, oh, well, if you didn't know, then okay, then never mind. No, you know why? Because ignorance is not an end run around responsibility. And you will be held accountable, right? You know, as a general rule, when you're going that much faster than everybody else. And you know, as a general rule, when there's something about which you're going to say, I would rather ask forgiveness for this than ask permission to do this, you know you're not supposed to do that. You would rather choose ignorance, close your eyes to it, and say, well, nobody told me, than do the responsible, grown-up, mature thing. And people think that they're going to get away with this. But I'm telling you, on Judgment Day, you can't just say, well, I closed my eyes and chose ignorance. That's not going to wash. Belshazzar didn't know and didn't want to know. So he closed his eyes and he pretended that chapter 4 didn't have anything to do with him. Look at the last sentence of chapter 4. This is Nebuchadnezzar, his father, writing this. Those who walk in pride, God is able to humble. And Belshazzar just says, you know what? I'm just going to pretend like that's for somebody else. That obviously does not apply to me. That applies to other people, my dad, or people who lived a long time ago, or whatever. But me, no, that doesn't apply to me. Instead, he just decides to throw another party. and pour another drink and practice what we could call strategic avoidance. And we do this with a lot of different things in our lives. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to hear about it. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to contemplate it. We don't want to reflect on it because we're afraid if we do any of those things, we'll be convicted and it'll cause us pain and we'll have to change our lifestyle. So, everybody, just talk about other stuff, but don't talk to me about the way I drive. Or don't talk to me about the words I use on the golf course. Or don't talk to me about the way I pad my expense report when I travel. Because everybody does that, and that's just the way you succeed in this world. And don't talk to me about when I call the person and say, I paid it last week, I promise, even though you know you didn't. Don't talk to me about any of those kinds of things. Let's talk about love and grace and forgiveness and all that kind of stuff. Let's not talk about these other areas. I don't want to think about them. I don't want to look at them. I don't want to contemplate them. I would rather choose ignorance because I think that buys me out of being responsible to do those things. Don't talk to me about how I spend my money. Don't talk to me about what I do on my day off. Don't talk to me about the internet sites I visit. Don't talk to me about those things. Don't talk to me about how much I paid for my house and how in debt I am and what don't talk to me about those things. I don't want to hear about it. I just want to close my eyes and plug my ears and go la 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 and coast into heaven, and then I can say, what? I didn't know I was supposed to, what? You didn't like the fact that I had 5 credit cards that were totally maxed out and I couldn't give any money to missions because I was busy giving it all to Visa? What? That wasn't wise? What? You mean you actually, saw me when I was driving 80 miles an hour and I gave that guy the finger? What? Is there something wrong with that? Nobody ever said there was something wrong with that. We would rather choose ignorance over responsibility, but I'm telling you, there's no end run around this. And the sad thing is, so many people are going to get there. And they're going to face God, and God's going to look at them, and He's going to say, what did you do with all that stuff I gave you? Well, big screen, flat screen, 3-screen, blue screen, boat, SUV, BlackBerry, wireless. And just, and God's going to say, you knew. You knew. You sat in that Wednesday night class and you watched John do that parallelism that talked about doing what is right and treating people who are marginalized in society. And the way you treat the poor is the way God judges us. You heard all that stuff week after week after week. You heard all the things about what I'm trying to do, creating a community, and you still withheld forgiveness from those people. And you still practiced dishonesty with those people. And you knew better. You say, I know what's right, and I know God will judge, and I know one day I'm going to die, and I know it's wrong, but I still do it. So let me just ask you to get real personal about this. Is there any area in your life where you're just closing your eyes and saying, la 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 la, I don't know, I don't want to know, I'd rather ask for forgiveness than permission? Don't do it. Don't close your eyes to this. Because ignorance is not an excuse. Maybe you're working too much and your kids are growing up and you're missing it. Or maybe you got problems just letting your anger fly and you're not supposed to do that, but hey, nobody in my office is a Christian anyway, and so they're not going to. Maybe there's a forgiveness issue. You've been withholding forgiveness from somebody and or maybe there's somebody you need to ask forgiveness from. And you should go to them and you should say, I did it and it was wrong and I'm sorry. And you just haven't. He's got to forgive me. We're Christians. Is there an area in your life? Don't close your eyes to it. Belshazzar knew better. And God writes 3 words. And each word has kind of a double meaning here. Jewish people love this kind of thing, where it's, one word and it has kind of 2 different meanings. So each one is a unit of measurement, like a ton or a pound or an ounce. So it's a unit of measurement, but each word also has another meaning as well. So the implication is that Belshazzar has been measured or weighed or evaluated somehow. And each word pokes a hole in an illusion that Belshazzar is clinging to. So the first word is mene. And it kind of means numbered. Okay? Mene means numbered. And the illusion that this one kind of gets to is the idea that this is my life. It's my life and I'm the king and nobody gets to say what I do with my life. Because nobody's going to hold me accountable and nobody can tell me what to do because I'm the king of my life. And I can do with it whatever I want. And God comes and says, I've got your days numbered. I've got your days numbered. And it's not just your life. I gave it to you. And one day I'm going to ask you what you did with it. And so you think everyone is accountable to you. Turns out you're accountable to me. Now, you know, we imagine what Daniel's response to seeing these sacred objects used for pagan purposes, we imagine that he would be mortified by this, and rightfully so. But understand this, the most sacred object that Belshazzar was profaning was not a golden goblet, but was his own life. Because that's how God views us. When you take your life and you use it for a pagan purpose, God sees that the way Daniel would have seen them using the instruments of worship for pagan purposes. So your life is supposed to be set apart for God's service. So the first word is mene. The second word is tekel. Tekel. And tekel means you've been weighed. You've been weighed and found wanting. You've come up short. Weighed and found wanting. And you've come up short. And the illusion that this one kind of gets to is the idea that a lot of people have that I can do whatever I want. I can even do bad things, things I know are wrong, and I can get away with it. That getting caught, that's for other people. Other people get caught, I don't get caught. Other people who aren't as smart or as clever or as together or as in charge as I am, they're the ones who get caught. I don't get caught. And it kind of reminds me of when we lived in Texas several years ago. Annabelle was, let's see, this would have been like 3-4 years ago. She'd have been like 2.5 or 3 years old. And for some reason, Annabelle got it in her head that if she couldn't see you, you couldn't see her. And so at night when she's supposed to be in bed, this is the funniest thing. We have a picture of it at home. She would take. We had a little basket that we put books in that sat in her room. And one night she emptied the basket and put the basket over her head and came walking out of her room. So there's a little girl with a basket over her head, and she thought, I can't see you, so you can't see me. She's bumping into walls and, feeling her way around. She's moving into the kitchen trying to find a cookie or something like that. I remember the first time I saw it, I was sitting in the living room. I was working on my laptop because I was in graduate school at the time, so I was working on a paper, and I just saw something peripherally and it really freaked me out. And I looked, and it was my daughter with a basket on her head. It even freaked me out even more. And she must have done this 4 or 5 times before she figured out, he can see me. The crazy thing is, we think that if I can't see you, you can't see me. You see? And so we hide. We hide. And especially, I see this so many times in the church, when someone falls into a sinful pattern and they just think, if I close my eyes, no one else will know that I'm doing this. But the crazy thing is, it doesn't matter what the people around you see or don't see. There is a God who sees everything. And Belshazzar thinks, I'll never get caught. But God sees and God knows, and God's monitoring every thought, every word, every action, every motivation. There are no secrets from God. The third word is Perez. And it means broken or divided. Your kingdom is broken or divided and taken away from you. And the illusion that this one kind of gets to is I'm in control of my circumstances. That I can maintain the unity of my kingdom and that I will pass my kingdom on to whomever I want to pass it on to. And God says, listen, I put you in that position. I can take you out of that position. I can break your kingdom in half. I can splinter it into a million different pieces. I'll give your kingdom to whoever I want to. You don't get to say the outcome of all of your circumstances. You're not in control of all of your circumstances. You can't even control the day you die. Remember in the New Testament, Jesus tells a story about a guy who it kind of fits this description too, who says, boy, look at all the stuff I got. I need to tear down my barns and build bigger barns, and then I'll be fat and happy. And so he does just that. He tears down his barns. He builds bigger barns. He fills those barns full of stuff. And then he says, all right, from now on, it's just going to be eat, drink, and be merry. And God comes to him and says, we're done. Game over. But you remember the word that God chooses to use to describe him? Fool. Not foolish. Fool. You fool. Wow, Jesus, that's harsh. Come on, calm down. We're not supposed to use that kind of language. Jesus is not just being mean. Jesus chooses his words very wisely. He says only a fool would plan for all of those contingencies and fail to plan for the one inevitability that we're all born rolling towards, and that is our own death. It's the one thing that's going to happen to all of us. We're all going to die, and then what? And if you fail to plan for that one event, I got no other word for you than that's just foolish. That's just only a fool would go through life never thinking, one of these days, my number is going to be up. And what then? Numbered, weighed, broken. Man, that's harsh. If you get to the end of your life and that's your tombstone, you've done something terribly, terribly wrong. You only have one life. And then what? There's coming a day of accounting. Because as much as God is the Lord of the generous gift, He is also the Lord of the balanced book. And one day He will come and He will say, what did you do with all of the stuff I gave you? I gave you time. I gave you creativity. I gave you energy. I gave you people. I gave you my word. I gave you my spirit. I gave you money. I put you in the most affluent society in the history of humanity. And you spent it all on yourself? You knew better. Question. How long is your life? How many more days you got? Do you know? You know for sure if tonight was your night. Very few of us understand that we've been numbered. Daniel says tonight is it. Tonight's your last night on earth. And then there's just silence. Imagine that. 1,000 people in the room. Wives, concubines. There's been drinking in this room. And now, talk about a buzz kill. You know, I mean, everybody is sober now. Okay? Everybody has sobered up. And we wait. What's he going to do? Well, what did his father do when his father was in a similar situation? His father finally hit rock bottom and turned his eyes towards heaven. Is that what the son is going to do? Will he raise his eyes towards heaven? Will he humble himself? Will he submit himself? Will he serve? Will he be like the prodigal son who finally comes to his senses and returns home to the Father who's waiting to receive him? Will he be like the thief on a cross who says, I have no other hope right now, and just throw up a prayer in hopes that maybe somebody out there will grab hold of it and answer it? Everyone waits in silence now. Verse 29. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Belshazzar dies alienated from God. And chapter 5 stands in stark contrast to chapter 4 about two options you have when God humbles you. You can look up to Him, or you can go out exercising your own power. Numbered, weighed, broken, you knew. Now, most of the people who come to this class are Christians, but and again, I don't know everybody in this class, so I can't say that for everybody, but most of the people in this class I know are Christians. If you're not, let me just say this. Numbered, weighed, and broken. That describes every single person in this room, whether you're a Christian or not. Okay? That describes all of us. Everybody has been numbered. Everybody has been weighed and found wanting, and we're all broken. And that's why Jesus came, to remove the penalty that is due to us. And if you need to get right with Him, do whatever it takes. Find somebody, talk to them tonight. But for most of us who are Christians, let me say this, just one word to us, okay? Do you have any unfinished business? I mean, is there any area of your life where if tonight was your night, God would look at you and say, you knew? Is there anything in your life, any unfinished business, any relationship that needs to be mended, any sin that needs to be confessed and dealt with, any pattern of addiction that needs to be broken, any area in your life where you have some unfinished business? Tonight really could be your night. Let's stand for prayer. God, you've been so patient with us, and you offer us opportunity after opportunity. And you come tonight again with open arms, ready to receive anyone who will simply turn their gaze towards heaven. So, Father, I pray that we will have the courage to look at those areas in our lives that we've been avoiding and to feel the weight of conviction that your Spirit brings, so that we can feel the liberating freedom of confession and forgiveness. God, I pray that tonight chains will be broken, sin will be addressed head on, and that unfinished business will be taken care of. Teach us, Father, to number our days so that we can make our days count. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.